What's been in the news this week and what looks like will remain in the news are uprisings in Wisconsin, people in the legislature running out of town in Wisconsin and Indiana. I reported to you today that a place in Detroit, Allen Park, is laying off the entire fire department of 25 workers. They're just laying them off. I don't know who's going to come and take a fire out. But anyway, maybe they'll go back to a volunteer fire department. But they're laying off a 25-person fire department. Providence, Rhode Island is planning to pink slip all the teachers. The school district is planning to send out dismissal notices to every one of 1,926 teachers, an unprecedented move that has union leaders up in arms. This was reported today in the Journal in Providence. Superintendent Tom Brady wrote the Providence School Board on Thursday that they will vote on a resolution to dismiss every teacher effective the last day of school. So we need to know what's going on. What are the laws? What are the parameters? I'm looking at maps that show that half the states approximately have collective bargaining for public unions. Others don't. What does it mean? What does all of this mean? So I invited somebody who knows more than I do about the subject to come on the show to be an expert and to educate us about these terms that are being bandied about that most of us really don't know what they mean. So I want to welcome to the Lisa Wexler Show today Professor Lowell Turner of the Cornell University School of Industrial and Labor Relations. He is a professor and he teaches on international and comparative labor and collective bargaining. Welcome to the Lisa Wexler Show today, Professor.
Thank you, Lisa.
So Professor Turner, first of all, can you help me define the terms? What is collective bargaining?
Collective bargaining is the mechanism by which workers get collective representation. I mean, collective bargaining is what unions do. They bargain on behalf of a workforce over the conditions of employment, wages, benefits, and so on.
So what does it mean to have compulsory collective bargaining, and what does it mean to not have it be compulsory? Does that mean if it's not compulsory, there are, in fact, no unions? Can you explain a little bit?
Well, collective bargaining, if you step back, Wisconsin was actually the first state to pass a law giving its public workers the right to collective bargaining. And then in 1962, President Kennedy issued an executive order giving federal workers the right to collective bargaining. And then since then, it's been on a state-by-state basis. And like you said, some states have it and some don't. But if workers have collective bargaining rights, then that means that unions can be represented by a union, and the union can then bargain with the employer, and the employer would be the local government or the state government or whoever it is that they're working for, or the school board if it's teachers, and that they would have the right to do that. It doesn't mean they have to do it, but it means they have the right to do it.
Okay, so in states where they don't
take away that right, what the governor's trying to do in Wisconsin is take away that right, so that workers can't do that even if they want to.
Okay, so let's talk about that. So if they can't organize, then how does it work? Because I always think of groups like groups of teachers. An individual teacher isn't going to negotiate his or her salary. In other words, how will it work without collective bargaining?
Yeah, well, that's why we had collective bargaining in the first place. You have to go beg the legislature for a raise or something, or they make people independent contractors or something. Basically, what happens is workers lose their bargaining power. What Walker wants to do, he says he's not going to completely eliminate collective bargaining. He's just going to limit it to wages, and the wages would be capped at the cost of living or something. But you couldn't bargain about a lot of other things like health care, pensions, and so on and so forth. So he basically strips the collective bargaining of most of its content, and then he has other measures in there that will weaken the unions. I mean, what this really is a political attack on unions from the right. That's the essence of the story.
But I want to get back to, I understand the political piece of it, but I really want to get back to the legal framework for it, because I must be really a dunce, because I don't understand this. In the absence of the right to collectively bargain, when you were, let's say you become a teacher, a sanitation worker, is it a take it or leave it salary, and then that's the way it is? I mean, how does it work?
Yeah, that's how it is.
Okay.
It's a take it or leave it salary. You can go in there and say, I need a raise, or I'm going to leave, and they can say, oh, you're a really good teacher, we want you, we'll give you a raise, or they can say goodbye, and you don't have any legal rights beyond that. I mean, you have legal rights in terms of discrimination, if you think they're firing you because you're a woman or because you're black or something, you have those kind of legal rights. But otherwise, you have no bargaining power.
Okay, so in Indiana, in Wisconsin, in a lot of different states, the Republicans have taken the helm of government, and one of the things they promised to do in their election campaign was to take on the perceived power of the unions, the perceived waste and inefficiencies of the unions.
Right.
And so that's really what's happening politically right now. But in the states in which it's been repealed, for example, Mitch Daniels in Indiana, I think in 2005, the first thing he did was to get rid of collective bargaining. Well, it's now been 6 years. Are there any studies, Professor? Is there anything that anyone's looked at with respect to Indiana? Have results changed? Is the budget better? Are fewer talented people coming to the state? In other words, do we know the impact of getting rid of collective bargaining?
No, I don't know. I haven't seen data on Indiana, but we do know that, Indiana has a crisis right now, too, and so obviously getting rid of collective bargaining wasn't the answer. There's one interesting piece of data, which is that that if you look at the states where teachers don't have collective bargaining rights, by and large, those states have lower average SAT scores than states where teachers do have collective bargaining rights. That's not to say there's a causal relationship, but that is to say that getting rid of collective bargaining is not the answer to education reform or public budgets or anything else. It's a purely political process that's going on now.
Okay, so and when you have collective bargaining and you have the right to unionize, do you then come under the framework of the NLRB, of the National Labor Relations Board, or not necessarily?
No, that's in the private sector.
Okay.
That's in the private sector, and then states, each individual state that has collective bargaining rights has its own set of state labor laws for its public sector.
Okay. So the NLRB is exclusively private unions, and when you have municipal unions and state unions, that's governed by a different kind of board and different resolutions of arbitrated disputes. Okay.
That's right. For example, New York has PERB, the Public Employee Relations Board, that is like the NLRB, but it's for the state of New York. It's for public workers. Okay.
Now, as a professor, as somebody who has studied this, Mr. Turner, can you tell us a little bit about the ways in which, in your view, if you have a view about this, that the unions have lost the trust and faith of a lot of people because of things like feather bedding, of different kinds of things in which people who have worked at unions have said, you know what, even I have to admit, it really wasn't the right way to work.
Yeah. I think that there's not as much truth to that as we read about in the media. I mean, they've not, by and large, unions have not lost the support of public sector workers, and that's where unionization is the highest. In the private sector, unions have been driven down, and they've been driven down by employer opposition to unions over the last 30 years. And they're not as strong, and they can't do as much as they used to be able to do. But if you look at the excesses that you're talking about, this is like when you hear about something like this, it makes the news. Mm-hmm. But research has shown that there is actually less corruption overall in unions than there is in business, for example.
Okay.
The feather bedding is something that is largely a thing of the past, but it's a myth that gets trotted out, just like the myth that unions are violent because, in the last century they used to fight battles in the coal fields and so on. And these are, this is simply not consistent with reality. It's consistent with a political ideology that's opposed to unions and collective bargaining.
Our telephone number is 203-845-3044. If you would like to question Professor Turner, he's an expert as a professor of international and comparative labor and collective bargaining. And the telephone number again, 203-845-3044. Professor Turner, you teach on international. I'd like to know, is our model of unions, is it spreading to Asia, for example?
No, not specifically our model. I mean, every country builds its labor movement, and we're looking at the Egyptians building an independent labor movement now, which is an important part of their transition to democracy. And they do it on their own traditions, they do it on their own history, and they might learn things from other countries. But these days, when countries in Asia or other countries, when people are trying to build independent labor movements, they're more likely to go and look at Germany or Sweden or somewhere where unions are much stronger and have had more success over in recent decades than they are to come and look at the U.S.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, compared to Europe, we really are very weak. You hear about labor strikes in France every other day. Orly Airport in Paris is closed.
The French love to strike. Right?
They love to strike, and that's true. I guess you can look at those very, very powerful entities. Although, of course, they're having their own economic problems, I wonder if they're going to turn against their own unions at some point, too.
Well, they have some of the same conflicts over there, but there's a more general understanding that unions are not the problem, and it's much harder to. You can't attack. Sweden has 80% union membership density, and if you're employers or if you're the state, you just can't attack unions. You have to negotiate the terms of change, and in Sweden, they've been very successful in doing that in terms of budget balance and things like that. And we have this typically American. Almost uniquely American ideology that I own the company and nobody tells me what to do, and I'm not going to let the unions have any voice or say. And there's a sort of anti-union managerial ideology in this country that is largely absent in much of the rest of the world, and especially in Europe. And the Europeans have done great. The Germans have done very well economically with very strong unions, and no one's attacking the unions in Germany the way they are here. This kind of thing is unheard of. They look at Wisconsin and say, "What's the matter with you guys?"
Yeah, and what do you think about what's happened in Wisconsin? Were you surprised when the people finally came to the streets and protested all this?
No, I wasn't surprised at all. And if I could just step back and put some perspective on it.
Sure. Please.
This is a watershed battle that goes way beyond Wisconsin, and I couldn't have predicted that it was going to break out like this in Wisconsin, but it was clear to me that it was going to break out somewhere. We had, in the post-war period from the 40s through the 70s, we had 30 years of a sort of managed, regulated capitalism, where we had economic growth, we had rising wages, we had strong unions, we had an economy that worked well. After economic crisis in the 70s, we got the Reagan Revolution, and then we got 30 years of a more free market capitalism, of deregulation, of a tax on unions, and then 30 years, and along with that, 30 years of average wage stagnation. So average wages didn't rise for 30 years. All of this crashed in the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. We saw the logic of a capitalism too deregulated, run wild, and now what we're in the midst of is a years-long battle for what the next 30 years is going to look like. It's not going to look like the last 30 years. We figured that it was. And so what we've got on the one hand is we've got the Tea Party saying, wanting to push us in even more of a free market direction. And then on the other hand, you've got now, for example, the trade unionists in Wisconsin. You've got what I might call the Obama coalition, the trade unions, the young, and so on, pushing for a different kind of vision of the future. And so whether the battle was going to break out in Wisconsin or somewhere else, this is the battle line we're going to be living with for several years. And this is just the most dramatic moment.
Yeah, and I think that and it's interesting that you describe it as a watershed event. I've been saying that this is going to be a watershed issue for the 2012 presidential election as well. I see right. Battle lines being drawn about this. And listen, people will have to figure out where they stand on it. That's the bottom line. That is the bottom line. Well, I want to thank you, Professor Lowell, for being on the show today, and thank you for explaining collective bargaining and giving us your historic view on what's going on right now. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Lisa. It was a pleasure.
A pleasure for me.